Welcome back to the Crafted Reality podcast. In this month's podcast, we talk to Dr. Jenny Kidd, a long-time collaborator who takes us through some of her highlights when it comes to research around heritage and digital. We also get to talk about the future and hint at a new project that we are about to begin. But just before we do, please do consider sharing or liking our podcast on whichever channel you are using. Thanks again, and hope you enjoy. So welcome, Jenny Kidd.
Hello. Thank you for having me.
That's okay. Welcome to Crafted Reality. This is our lovely setup. Julian's in the corner there, looking fine with his headphones on. And we also are accompanied by Bobby Dog. So at some time,
importantly,
absolutely head of wellbeing. She will be, I'm sure, having some conversations with us at some point. So if you hear a little scurry of feet,
that's me running away.
Yeah. With your little tap dancing shoes. So welcome. It would be lovely to hear a little bit about what you do and what's your origin story?
Yeah, we were saying we haven't really kind of had that conversation previously. I'm a reader at Cardiff University, which basically means that I research and teach in the university. I'm in the School of Journalism, Media and Culture. And most of what I do is at the kind of media and culture end of the school and its interests. So in terms of my origin story, I guess one of the things that is really important in understanding that kind of origin story is my interest in stories. This has been something, as I've been reflecting on, what is the kind of thread through the work that I've done. I think it's that kind of, interest in stories. And that was kind of where I started. I grew up as somebody who loved reading, loved stories, and I had always wanted to work in publishing. So I wanted to sit in a kind of, dusty bookshop in a corner somewhere, reading manuscripts and making decisions about whether what I was reading was interesting or not. And so I decided that I would do a publishing degree. So after my undergraduate programme, which was in English, I went to do a publishing master's programme. Very excited. Turned up on the first day, sat in amongst all of my new course colleagues. There must have been 60 or 70 of us. Excited to learn about publishing and to think about books. And our first lecturer stood up on that first day and said to us all, this group of enthusiastic, excited youngsters, that anyone who is here because they love books might as well leave now. Oh, wow. And he said, publishing is all about pound signs, it's about units, it's about shifting copy, it's basically a business studies programme. And you could just almost hear 65 hearts break in the room. And that was the day I decided I would not go into publishing. And it was kind of, quite a moment for me. So I did complete my publishing MA.
I mean, well done.
Against all the odds. And one of the things I really enjoyed when I was doing that MA programme was learning about digital publishing and starting to do a bit of web design. And that was something then I thought, okay, I can kind of grasp onto this. This might be something that I could do with myself. And we're talking about like early 2000s at this point, 2001. So we're kind of way back in the Dreamweaver 4 days, mucking about with HTML and all the rest of it. So I was like, right, okay, this is for me. So I went and became a web designer. And I moved to London and I worked for a TV company, a small TV company called A Different Kind of Television, who were at that time trying to experiment with what interactive television might look like in the very early days of red button technology. So thinking about, cable services and what we could do there to try and tell different stories or provide services or whatever it might be. Really early days of that technology. And A Different Kind of Television, DKTV, was working with local councils in London and trying to, provide services for people so they could do things like go onto their television, press the red button and report an abandoned car in their street. Or they could find out whether there was somebody living locally who might want to swap houses with them if they were living in social housing. And they were also kind of trying to tell stories about local communities. So, shorts, getting people in front of the camera, very much kind of Video Nation kind of, style. lots of interaction, lots of participation, and lots of emphasis on community. So I was doing the website and, struggling on with all of that, Dreamweaver before. So, so I was doing that for a year. And then I saw an advert for a PhD scholarship, which was all about digital storytelling. And I really liked the look of it, applied for it. That was at Cardiff University. And I got the gig. So I moved to Cardiff to do my PhD. And so this digital storytelling PhD, this is a very long-winded answer to your question.
It's fascinating. I had no idea, because I read on your bio on the Cardiff University website, previously web development. I was like, that's interesting. And I was like, I had no idea. Yeah. And there's no other real type of web development apart from web development. And I was like, this is fascinating. So yes, carry on.
It wasn't for long, and it was a bit painful because it was all very involved at that point. Well, as it still is now, I'm sure. Julian would agree. So we can edit that bit out.
There's a lot of post in this. So it's fine.
So I started doing the PhD. So that involved working alongside BBC Wales and studying their Capture Wales digital storytelling programme. And I really loved doing my PhD. Lots of people embark on a PhD and find it quite a kind of solitary thing to do. It's a bit of a weird thing to do, doing a PhD. But I just loved mine because I was working so closely with this incredible initiative where they were travelling all over Wales and setting up these kind of technology workshops and storytelling workshops in local community halls, miners' clubs, all the rest of it, and teaching people how to do digital storytelling. And this again, it's like early 2000s. People largely didn't have mobile phones, or they just had the old kind of bricks, so no smartphones, and a lot of people didn't have access to computers and the web. And so it was kind of really working with people through a process, trying to find a story, familiarizing them with the kit, and helping them to communicate a story that felt powerful to them. So it was a brilliant initiative, and my job was to kind of go to workshops, to sit with people, to help them, but also to encourage them to kind of reflect on what it meant to tell their stories in that kind of a way. So it was a kind of impact study, if you like, of Capture Wales. So I finished that in 2005. Very much kind of, emphasis there on digital culture, digital storytelling. And then I went to do a postdoctorate at Manchester University. And at that point then, I started working on the Performance Learning and Heritage project. So I was the kind of research associate on that project. And that involved then a kind of segue into thinking about museums and the stories that museums tell. So Performance Learning and Heritage was all about museum theatre and live interpretation. So using performance in museums, and again doing a bit of an impact study of that. So what is it that people get out of those interactions with performers in those kinds of contexts, and what might they learn about history in doing that? And I saw lots of crossover between the work that I've been doing digitally with Capture Wales and the work that I was then doing with museums. So, thinking about how you could tell different kinds of stories, perhaps, how you could layer stories in space, how you could perform stories, how different kinds of media and mechanisms can be used, to tell, multimedia kind of stories. So digital heritage then as a kind of research interest was something that kind of, emerged quite naturally from all of those different projects for me. And so I guess since that time, I've been a digital heritage person and a kind of digital culture person in the research that I've done. And so cutting the very long story a bit short, eventually I ended up back at Cardiff University in 2012. And I think it was late 2012 or early 2013 when we met, and we'll go on to talk a bit about the kind of work that we've been doing together since that time.
So you'd only just landed in Cardiff?
Yeah.
Wow,
yeah.
Okay. I had no idea. I thought you were sort of really deeply embedded in Cardiff. No.
That was all bravado. No, I had been at City University in London for 4 years before I came to Cardiff, working in a cultural policy department. So again, kind of thinking about museums, heritage sites, but the creative industries more broadly, and doing, digital work and working in partnership with different kinds of institutions there as well.
which kind of now understanding the journey that you've been on to date, it totally makes sense that a lot of the projects that you've done are really, really collaborative. So I'd read that you'd been involved in partnerships with loads of cultural institutions, so historic royal palaces and Tate Britain. Were there any memorable projects that you worked on or collaborations that you'd like to tell us about and their outcomes that you have fond memories of?
Yeah. Well, obviously the work, I've done in collaboration with Yellow Brick. That's a given. We'll come on to that. Okay, so memorable collaborations. I think probably the most memorable and possibly one of the kind of most long-term collaborations that I was involved with, and actually this wasn't very digital in its nature, was the work that I did with historic royal palaces. And that was in collaboration with Joanne Sainer, who is at Newcastle University now. And it was also in collaboration with Imperial War Museums obviously historic royal palaces as well, and in particular the Tower of London. So we had started a kind of collaborative project. I think this must have been in about 2010 or 2011, which was all about exploring kind of challenging histories. And we'd set up a network and we would get lots of people together to talk about, how can we work more responsibly, sensitively, carefully when it comes to the interpretation of challenging heritages. And the Tower of London were one of the partners on that work. And we would all get together and we would talk about, various different kinds of projects, various different kinds of challenges. And then one day, our contact at the Tower of London came in and said, oh my goodness, they're going to put, 800,000 or whatever it was, poppies in the moat at the Tower of London. And we were all like, oh, wow, okay, that's kind of, quite a stunning idea. And of course, then that became this incredibly infamous kind of project to commemorate the centenary of World War I, where they put the poppies in the moat at the Tower of London. So around the edges of the installation, the Tower were really keen to encourage people to engage kind of reflectively and maybe even critically with what they were doing with those poppies in the moat. And so we worked with them to come up with a kind of learning programme that sat alongside the poppies installation, which was called Why Remember. And which they used to do all sorts of different kinds of work. So they did work with schools, they did work with performers, they did a TV programme, I think, for the Discovery Channel as well. So, all sorts of different kinds of mechanisms for engaging people with this Why Remember programme. And the Why Remember programme was asking people to reflect on, why we commemorate, why we remember, why it's important to remember, and how we should go about remembering. And, in the kind of context of this kind of, installation that was in the Tower moat, those became quite kind of, powerful prompts for people to reflect. So we spoke with something like, I think it was 1,800 people or something in London who had turned, and there were millions of people who turned up, I'm sure you remember, to see those poppies, and politicians were standing in front of them and, giving their spiel and all the rest of it. So we spoke with, something like 1,800 people and asked them about their interactions with that installation and to reflect on remembrance. And we wrote a paper about that, which you can find and have a look at. But we also then took our kind of questions and our research on tour with the poppies, because you may remember, it feels like ancient history, some of this, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Two bits of the poppies installation went on tour all around the country. So there were two installations, and there was the Wave and Weeping Window that went all around the UK. To be installed in different kinds of heritage contexts. And I think there were 17 installations of those. And so that over the course of the centenary, so I think it was over the 5-year period of the centenary. And we went on tour with our questions, and we spoke to, I think it was again another couple of thousand people, and asked them to reflect on remembrance. And then that work helped to inform then another piece of work that happened at the Tower, kind of to mark the end of the centenary, which I'm going to struggle to remember the name of. it will come back to me.
Okay.
Which was a different kind of provocation that they put in the moat to mark the end of the centenary. And again, we were there with our questions. So that was a kind of, a long and very involved collaboration, which was, hugely rewarding, lots and lots of partners. And yeah, just, it was a real privilege to have those conversations with people in very different kinds of contexts. And, talking to people about the poppy in Northern Ireland, it's a very different kind of a conversation that you're having than if you talk to them in, Hay-on-Wye or in Orkney or, whatever. So it was an incredible data set that we amassed from that collaboration. Yeah. So that was, a big old project.
And what kind of responses did you have from people in relation to the artwork?
A lot of what we got from people was quite kind of practiced ways of talking about remembrance and talking about war. Often a lack of criticality, actually, which was interesting. Some people would be critical, and especially in some contexts they would be critical. Again, Northern Ireland being the most notable example of that. And I think actually older people were maybe more critical in their reflections on kind of remembrance and our kind of broader practices of remembrance, not just the poppies installation itself. What we actually found when we talked to younger people was more of that kind of quite practiced, quite sedimented way of talking about remembrance. Lest we forget, we must remember. A lot of those kind of tropes about, remembrance and about World War I, perhaps especially, kind of coming through in the responses, and a kind of a bit of a sense that people were not engaging with it maybe as critically as we might have hoped that they would, and all of that then kind of informed then the way that they marked the end of the centenary with this last installation in the moat, which was I would say more provocative and encourage people to engage, I think, more critically.
And when you undertake this kind of research, how do you structure that research in terms of questions and getting people to, I suppose, answer openly? And I understand you can't always do that, but how do you go about framing those questions, and in what settings do you ask those questions? Does that vary, or is it the same, or do you have a kind of general way that you do it as a researcher?
Yeah, so I would say kind of looking across the research that I've done, I'm a big fan of multiple methods in studies. And so actually you could say that the Tower study, is very much kind of survey based, or these kind of, questions that we were asking people, they were, it wasn't like we were doing interviews as such. They were quite kind of, short questions, short responses from people in a kind of, survey style. And that was quite unusual for me. I'm much more used to working with kind of multiple methods. So I like using surveys, but really I would say I'm a kind of interview and focus group kind of a person, and using wherever possible kind of creative methodologies. So I think different projects lend themselves to different kinds of methods, and there are restrictions, limitations. I mean, you can't stop people in front at the Tower of London and ask them to give you 30 minutes of their time to sit down and have a full interview with you. Well, you could, but you maybe wouldn't get very far when you're largely dealing with tourists who are kind of rushing about the place. So yeah, you have to take different kinds of methods for different kinds of projects. I like it where I'm able to use, interviews or focus groups and then kind of combine them with other kinds of methodologies. As I say, kind of more creative or arts-based approaches. One of the things that we did with the Performance Learning and Heritage projects at Manchester University was use lots of creative methods. And some of that research was working with kids as well, so school kids who were coming along to the museums, and we would go into the schools and we would do mind mapping exercises with them, or we would get them to act out things that they had seen, or to draw pictures in response to it, or make a cartoon, or whatever it might be. And I really enjoyed that approach. And actually in that project, another thing we were able to do, which we really struggle to do in a lot of digital heritage work, was a kind of longitudinal study. So kind of, looking over time at what the impacts of those practices were on people. So we would interview people on or do a focus group with them, whichever approach was best for the museum we were working with. We would talk to them on the day, so they would watch a performance, then they would come and do an interview with us, and we would give them 20 quid for speaking to us. And so we would talk with them for 20 or 30 minutes, and then they would go off and finish their museum visit, and then we would phone them a week or two later and have another conversation with them. And then we would phone them again about 9 or 10 months later and have another conversation with them. So just to get that sense over time of how that visit and that performance, that interaction kind of was being kind of sedimented into their memories of the visit and what they might have taken away from it. Now, of course, the fact that we were having conversations with them also changed maybe what they were going to kind of remember or that kind of legacy of the visit for them. But it's really rare to get that kind of, opportunity to do that, longer term study. So that was really nice, and another kind of methodology that we were able to bring to that project. And we've used some really nice creative methods around the work that we've been doing as well. So and the new project, which maybe I'll say more about in a bit, is going to use another kind of set of methods again. So I like to try new methods and think about interesting ways of kind of combining them with maybe more traditional approaches. I've also done quite quantitative kind of stuff. A lot of what I've said there is very kind of qualitative, rich, deep kind of research that takes time and resources to do. But we've also done a fair bit of kind of quantitative stuff as well, looking at social media data, or doing kind of analyses of policy documents using kind of, online kind of digital humanities kind of, approaches. So I'm not averse to doing the quantitative stuff as well. It just depends what the project kind of demands.
Mm. And with the qualitative data, where do you start with that in terms of understanding? Because I can imagine you'd have volumes and volumes of content and data sets from that. How do you start by mapping that?
You can begin to map things quantitatively, as I've suggested. So you can take all of your interview transcripts, or you can take all of the responses from the Why Remember data, for example, which were all in Excel spreadsheets, and you can look for keywords, or you can put them into a system that will allow you to kind of track how people are using language across the entirety of the data set, and that tells you something about the data set, but it's often quite kind of remote. It's pulling keywords out, and you don't really know how people are using those key terms, so you've got to get into it in a bit more detail. So often what we will do if we've got a very large data set is take a kind of subset of that data and explore that in kind of richer, more qualitative terms. And if we're working with interview data or focus group data, we would again kind of explore that in more qualitative ways. So doing things like thematic analysis, so looking for kind of key themes that emerge throughout the data. And there you're just kind of sitting with the data really, which is really nice to do. And in my case, me and my highlighters, all very analog, going through and kind of color coding things that people have said to begin to pull out the kind of key strands and themes, and then that allows you then to kind of talk across the data in ways that are more meaningful. And to kind of pull, bits of data together. So you can say, well, this group of people felt like this about this experience, but this group of people felt, in this felt like this. And you can pull at the kind of language that they've used as well, which is something that we've done in the work that the research work that we've done around the experiences that we've worked on, really exploring what people have to say and what kinds of, lexical choices they use, what words are they using to describe these experiences, do they, volunteer, do they start talking about immersion before we even bring that into the conversation? Is that a term that kind of, occurs naturally to them as they're starting to talk about an experience? Or maybe they talk about something as being emotional, so we're not going and saying to them, did you find that emotional? But starting to see whether those things may emerge from the data. That's quite a kind of grounded approach to using the data, seeing what it suggests, what it tells us about what was important or significant in terms of an experience.
So you mentioned that we've worked together and we've done a few projects. So I think we were talking about this just before we started recording, how we met, and it was probably 2012, 2013.
Yep.
Where we'd got in touch with you, Yellowbrook had got in touch with you, said hi, because we'd found you on, I think, the Cardiff University website, because we were thinking about applying to a project fund, AHRC, and a project fund called React.
Yep.
And that particular project fund was looking at matching people from the creative industries with an academic body or partner. So we'd got in touch, and I think we met, had a chat, and we put together a little proposal, not really knowing whether we'd get it or not, but we were successful in that.
Yep.
And we eventually created a project called With New Eyes I See, which was an exploration of some of the things that you've discussed in terms of how do we look at taking stories from the past and bringing them into a space where we could have that discussion and prompt people to maybe think about some of the issues in and around not only that topic, but how that kind of could play out maybe within a physical space. So a little bit like the Poppies installation, how that can play out in a physical space to enable people to embody the experience, and does that change people's perception then of that archival material. So we got together and we went to the National Museum of Wales, which is now Amgueddfa, Cymru, and we looked at their archival material, and that was kind of fascinating because I've not really had a chance to ever do anything like that before. So working with yourself on that project and helping you to sort of unpick then that content was a really interesting process. Sort of like, where do you begin with these stories that are often, particularly in archives, very fragmented?
We found ourselves in the library and looking at some of the kind of institutional resources there. It's all coming back to me now.
Yeah, I know, and it does.
Yeah, and there were lots of annual reports, and so we were looking, and I guess a lot of people were talking about World War I and the commemorations at that time. And so we had to look back at, or I think anyway, there was a piece of work that was happening in the museum where they were looking back at the annual reports from during that period, World War I, and seeing how it had affected the museum. And they had come across this story then of this botanist, Cyril Mortimer Green.
Yeah, and I think that sort of unlocked some inspiration for us, hadn't it, in terms of how we can form a story around the archives, but doing that in a very delicate way. And I think one of the challenges is with archival material that we've said, that fragmentation, how do we then present that within a container or within a story or within an experience that actually makes sense then to people that are going to come and do it? And we talked a lot about that at length. How much does this story have to make sense, or can we use the fragmentation, the very nature of the archives, as a way to maybe just elicit or evoke an emotion?
Yeah.
And have almost snapshots, just like the archive materials that we were working with, have these snapshots that would elicit different feelings, different emotions that would move people through the story in that way, rather than it being very much that sense of a traditional linear story where it has to have a very solid beginning, a very solid middle, and a very solid end. And to a degree, some of that was there within the archives. We did have the beginning of the story where Cyril was working at the museum. We know that then he went to war, and we know then he didn't come back.
Yeah.
And then the bits in between then are sort of hazy.
Yeah.
So we talked a lot about how do we create an experience that allows people to move through that, but maybe have that sense of feeling. So that sense of excitement at being in the museum and working in the museum in a job that he loved, but then at a threshold where actually he didn't necessarily have any choice but to go to war. And how does that feel when perhaps that choice is taken away from you, and what does that actually mean? And then how do we express that sense of loss, not only of Cyril as an individual not coming back from the war, but also of the many, many, many people who did actually lose their lives during that period of time.
Including Cyril's brother, who had died, I think, 2 years before he died. Yeah.
Hugh, yeah. So again, how do we carefully and sensitively tell that story, and then allow people to have some kind of feeling and emotion towards that, and what that kind of means more broadly.
And Cyril was really interesting as well, because I think at the time the museum, the foundation stone had been laid, but the museum maybe hadn't been built, or it wasn't finished. And so I don't know that Cyril had ever set foot inside the museum.
Yes.
So that was intriguing to us. And I think was one of the reasons why we decided not to do the experience in the museum, but to do it, outside, kind of, in the wild instead. And so we did the experience. The experience started on the museum steps, but then people then went on a journey around the park, which is next to the museum. And which is a kind of, site of remembrance. There are lots of remembrance stones and monuments there. And we made that the kind of site for the experience. And people would we gave people a map. I was reminding myself of this morning. We gave people a map, and it had a number of different kind of markers for places within the park. And we also gave them, you'll have to kind of go into the technical bit on this, but we gave them a kind of old kind of miner's lamp, which had a torch in it and had all of the kind of kit in order to kind of, relay the story, so that people would engage quite seamlessly with the technology. It wouldn't be, it wouldn't be about the technology. That was quite kind of, hidden. And then people went around the space of the park and outside the museum, and the lamp would kind of project things onto surfaces within the park and on the outside of the museum. And so some of the things that were projected were kind of, documents, archival materials. There were some kind of animations that had been put together in order to kind of help tell the story, or, these fragments of the story. And there was a audio narration as well. And so at each of these sites, kind of something would happen, and some often it was the torch that was kind of facilitating the experience, somehow projecting, or the audio. But then there were also kind of like found objects. So some of the sites had found objects, a kind of a medical kit, or a white lab coat, or some specimens. Because one of the interesting things also about Cyril was that while he was away, he was sending back specimens to the museum. So those are in the collection, and so we kind of wanted to give that sense of how important the kind of his career as a botanist was, even whilst he was away and fighting. And in fact, I think the point at which you learned about Cyril, having died in the war, was you were stood at a tree, and on the tree there was a kind of quite haphazardly posted a lot of botany samples, and there was also a telegram there that told you that he had died. So yeah, it was using, working across the digital and the physical, which is something that I really like and am keen to do wherever possible. It was very kind of tactile, very much about the senses. There were lots of kind of pauses and silences in the experience as well. Some of those were quite kind of awkward silences. Some of those were poignant silences. There were lots of things going on with that experience.
I hope you're enjoying the podcast this month. We have some really exciting announcements over the next few months. So if you want to be in the know, do consider subscribing or following us. Yeah, because I think at the time we were making a lot of street games.
Yeah.
And we were interested.
I say that like it was me that was making
we were.
You were, yeah.
Yeah, we were interested in how you can use, I guess, the format of that within this experiences. So can we move people through a space and make it, I guess, quite nomadic in many respects, and again use the format that we often use within our street games of having people in really small groups of 6, and how that potentially could, as it does with street games, begin to generate conversation. So as you move between each location, those moments of travel in our minds when we were discussing the design of the project could be moments of reflection between the people within the group, or moments of conversation, or, as you said, moments of silence, and being comfortable or uncomfortable silences, and what that did to the experience then overall as 6 people moving through this experience together, which I suppose is sometimes a different experience to that when you're moving through a museum.
Yeah.
And I guess the etiquette or perceived etiquette and behaviours within museum spaces of, in my mind, going to a museum and being quiet. A bit like an art gallery. You go to an art gallery and you're supposed to be quiet, and there isn't necessarily that room for discussion. And I think maybe now things are definitely shifting and changing for those spaces to become, more social, more community, more discussion led within those spaces. But I think at the time, for me, I always just remember going on school trips, going to museums, and you're just being told to shush. And that not only suppresses, I guess, your excited response to being in those spaces as a young person, as a child, they are incredible spaces, but then also unintentionally suppressing discussion. And I think we were excited about subverting that to provoke discussion, to also elicit this sense of feeling towards this archival material, which often archival material, again, can feel so disparate from our lived experiences of now and understanding of lived experiences of then as well. I think we learned a lot with New Eyes I See in relation to sort of skimming the surface of understanding what the impact is of these projects, because we did run some few focus groups around this experience, just to understand how people interacted with it, what they felt. And I guess the thrust of the whole project was, can we create something that will give space for empathy? From our focus groups and our discussions with the people who had done the experience, we found that it did change that sense of behaviour around a heritage experience, in terms of the social element of it and what that meant in terms of discussion, and also the agency within the experience. So the format, I don't think we mentioned this earlier, but the format of it, alongside the map, you could decide where to go anywhere on the map. So it sort of almost mirrored our experience of looking through the museum's archive and placing it then, giving the audience the same type of experience where it's a non-linear journey and you have that agency and decision making to be able to go wherever you wanted to on the map. Maybe you decide to go to one location, go to 3 others, and maybe you go back to that original location because something has sparked a memory of a connection and you want to go back and re-understand it with new eyes, literally, because of the information that you'd already taken in. It gives you a new perspective on that maybe initial location that you first visited. So there was that we discovered that people did like that idea of being master of their own destiny within the experience. And then we did find that it did change people's relationship, not only with the physical space, which is one of memory, that they hadn't necessarily visited or been to before, or even understood why that space was built.
Yeah.
And then on top of that engagement then with the archive itself, having a little bit more understanding of that single person's journey through this story. And then encouraged people to have conversations about the stories, not only during, but then also afterwards, having that moment of reflection in the park. And I do remember a lot of the groups would stand by that tree with those images of the botany samples, and then seeing suddenly that telegram, and there was like a moment of silence, and some groups were standing there for ages before anybody spoke. And you could kind of see people taking that moment in and embodying it, which was, I think, really powerful. And a lot of people brought that up in the discussions about how they actually felt at the end of that journey of physically walking through this person's life and then coming to the end of it and having that moment of remembrance, or having that moment of collective experience and sharing that and what that meant to them and how that made them feel, which was really interesting for us as curators and creators to understand, or begin to understand, the impact of this work, which we don't often get in a lot of the projects that we make. There's not often that. There's internal project reflection, but you don't often get the time to be able to reflect with your participants, either because timelines move on or you're making work for clients and things move quite quickly. So having that space and time to begin to have that conversation was so useful for us as artists.
We had lots of conversations with people, didn't we, around the edges of With New Eyes I See. Somebody said, and I loved this quote, that they really liked it because it wasn't yawny, like a kind of typical museum experience. And I do think, people, it's almost like a fetishization of this kind of idea of a museum, and we see it a lot in research. But as you say, very often when you go to museums now, you're having all sorts of different kinds of experiences. But if you ask somebody what a museum is, they'll tell you it's yawny and it's full of glass cases. And so, there's still that kind of perception, for sure.
And just a question on that. Do you think that's because of digital, in the sense of, so there's archival material that has been in an archive, in a dusty archive, not really viewed before. Someone's probably thought the story isn't good enough, or there's not enough kind of it. And then you've got this digital element that kind of allows you to glue things together to create something that's a bit bigger. So you've kind of got this element of, you could argue, democratizing the ability to share stories that were tiny and make, and bring light to them. But then equally, it sounds like there's other opportunities, like you say, the experiences in museums have kind of altered to be more experience-based rather than something in a glass box with a little plaque and that's the end of your kind of thing. And there's your assumption is that there's lots of stuff in the glass that's the same because they're in the same box, but beyond that you have nothing. And so I wondered if the digital gives you that affordance of story or background, but also maybe allows you to share new stories that were maybe untold.
So I think digital is a part of that and has really helped to kind of, open up the work of these institutions. But I think they have also been on a bit of a journey anyway in becoming more kind of, visitor-centred, audience-centred in probably since the kind of, even the 80s and 90s. So there was this kind of, this is me getting into the theoretical bit now.
I love this.
Kind of the new museology movement from kind of like the 80s and 90s, right, which was about trying to kind of open up the stories that institutions tell and to try and, represent previously underrepresented or, not, groups that just invisible groups, and silenced groups as well, and to try and diversify the stories that museums engage with. So I think digital has been a kind of part of that. It's been an important part of that, especially in recent years. But actually, I've even found myself reflecting more recently that some of the digital work that museums do can also squash down or flatten those opportunities as well. And that museums can be quite worried about what they're doing in the digital environment, especially in the environment of social media. So some do really nice, super creative, very kind of impactful work within social networks. But others really struggle with that. And, and you might find if you walked into those museums, you would have a whole bunch and range of encounters that are much more kind of open and much more storified and experiential and performative than the kinds of things you would do in their digital environment. So I think it's a complex picture, really.
You've got an organisation or organisations that effectively have been asked to collect things and say things about things that have happened, and then you've got this digital affordance that allows instantaneous commentary and creation, and suddenly they've just like, okay, everything you kind of have done, like considered, whether it's kind of however their opinions kind of laid out, and then suddenly now kind of be open and create almost feels almost like quite a radical change for them. And I can see why it takes so long.
Yeah, because I guess historically you're limited by the numbers of walls that you have or physical space that you have in a museum to display things within the archive.
Yeah.
Whereas I suppose digital really opens up that canvas, and it comes back down to how do our cultural institutions curate things. And I know that's quite as you said, a much broader, bigger discussion now that is more within the public realm about how do those institutions reflect all of our society in all its
It's quite a political conversation then as well, isn't it?
Beautiful and ugly facets,
wars,
isn't it? All of that.
Even that is very zeitgeisty or very of the time, so in 10 years time I'm sure the conversations will be altered and things like that. Yeah, it's just kind of interesting, I guess, going back to when you were talking about the first times you kind of involved digital and whether people saw value in digital up front, like when did that change? And I think we kind of always think about maybe like the iPhone being that moment where without the iPhone, a lot of things don't happen. Like Twitter doesn't exist really, Instagram doesn't exist, those kind of things. So it's almost like, when did digital become a thing within these organizations? When did it become and then equally, when was it a thing to collect data? When was it a thing to create experiences from? And then when was it a thing to then almost market? All those three things are kind of like tension against each other, I guess. It's just kind of interesting to see how that is. And I guess we'll maybe discuss it in a moment. One of the really interesting things is museums like the video game museum that was in Nottingham. I think it's just moved to Sheffield. Like, we're making all this stuff, but it's just disappearing. You cannot play a computer game from the 1990s unless you go to a museum to play it. So you can, if everything's culturally digital, and then where do you go to experience what happened? And then is there a past in that context? It's quite interesting.
There's been a big discussion about how museums, archives should think about born digital outputs. So, how do you collect a meme? What happens with social networks, all the rest of it. And that's interesting and really important, but it also kind of does really hammer home I think overemphasize the kind of intangible quality of digital stuff. And I think increasingly we are starting to think more about actually the kind of material realities of of digital bits and bobs. All of the kind of detritus that kind of sits in the cloud and has an environmental impact, and all of the old hardware that just kind of clutters up the place. So I think it's really helpful and productive, and I do this a lot with the students, to think about the kind of material story of digital stuff, and does that maybe help museums think about how to handle this stuff going forward, maybe. And that's been a big feature of the work that we've done, is thinking across the kind of digital, physical, thinking about the materiality of digital interactions. And I think especially with traces was something that we were able to think about quite carefully and productively. And the reflections were lovely. And I think we wrote a paper about those as well. And and people talked very openly about how emotional they'd become at parts during the experience. And then they were able to kind of, track that to their kind of, understanding of what was going on. So their understanding of Cyril and his life and the kind of gravity of war. But also I think people reflected a lot on that kind of fragmented nature of, history and museum making and, kind of opening up the idea of what a museum is, which, was really intriguing for us and certainly for me in terms of the research that I do. And I think one of my favourite kind of reflections that came through in those discussions was where people were talking about the ways in which, so the kind of significance of place, but the way that they'd kind of scripted in other things that were happening within that space into the narrative. And again, I think that informed maybe what we did a bit with Traces, but they would talk about things like the smell of the flowers, and they would talk about the noise of a helicopter, and they would kind of, script that into the story somehow, which was really powerful and something I don't think we had anticipated. Well, maybe you would have understood that potential better having done the street gaming previously, but for me that was quite kind of profound in terms of thinking about how you could use a space to tell a story, but how you couldn't control the space, but that could be quite kind of a productive thing as well. That was really quite a kind of exciting realization. So I think that the whole thing about place came through really powerfully in those discussions, and absolutely that sense that we had kind of disrupted here a kind of museum norm that people were used to expecting and articulating.
It was the beginning of a beautiful partnership, which led us on to another project that we worked on together called Traces, Olion, which was very much building on this project with New Eyes I See. So we had come together again, put in another funding application for a separate piece of work that continued to look at this sense of embodying journeys through heritage sites. And we continued to work with Amgueddfa Cymru, the museum, on this project. So they came on board as a partner to look at a different site that they look at called St Fagans, which is a place in Cardiff, which is the National
Museum of History.
Yep. Thank you. National Museum of History, which is a great place. Everybody, I think, who lived in Cardiff, that would be their school trip.
Yeah.
It has basically lots of different areas. So you've got this amazing space where they've rebuilt houses or dwellings through history. If you haven't been, go. It's incredible. And then they have another space, which is these beautiful gardens and the, I guess, original manor house that existed there on the site before the museum, I guess, took ownership of it or custodianship of it. So we started, I guess, with a recce of the site. We weren't quite sure exactly what stories we were going to tell. We weren't quite sure where the stories or journeys would lead us. So we sort of had a little wander around the site, and the gardens were very much a place where we felt had lots of potential. And through a lot of research and discussion with the staff at St Fagans, we realised that at the time the gardens weren't getting as much footfall as the other side, which is the houses and dwellings through history. And this was sort of mainly due to the site going through a huge period of development. So their main entrance had shifted. So the journeys that people were making were possibly slightly different from what they would normally make. So there was more footfall heavily onto one side of the site than the other. So we decided to focus our project on this side of the site that had less footfall. And again, we went through the same sort of process, didn't we? We had a look through the archives. We spent lots of time at the site, just physically being in the space and sort of absorbing that environment and the atmosphere.
We did some kind of like user needs stuff as well, didn't we?
Yes.
So we went and stood in the church for a day. We chatted with people who were just, wandering around the site about, what kinds of experiences they would like to see, what they'd enjoyed doing. And yeah, it was quite clear from the discussions we were having with people there that, everyone comes in the site and then they turn left. But I think that's the thing anyway, like in supermarkets and IKEA and, all the rest of it, people walk in and then they turn left. I don't know why.
I think it's a design thing, isn't it? And they set the high value items and stuff in to the left and stuff, or they make you go through bits that they're going to have to come back through.
And we had, I think, a session with staff as well, where we talked with them about what they would like to see and what some of the kind of challenges, might be, what would be the kind of limiting factors in terms of trying to do something on site. And at which point we kind of established that there was, very little connectivity. And so to do something digitally, we would have to be quite creative in how we went about that.
Yeah, there was quite a lot of restrictions because I think originally we wanted to create something similar to with New Eyes OC with projection and sound, but maybe have more installations so that you'd have, rather than carrying something around with you, you would be triggering points of these hubs of content through projection and sound. That was the kind of idea, but we realised quite quickly that infrastructure wasn't necessarily available to us, and also kind of maintenance of all of the kit and the equipment, and also limited by budget as well. And often, I guess, those types of restrictions are really useful because I think the project that we created was a better version of what we originally had in mind, as with things are often the case. So we ended up creating an app which journeyed people through or guided people through the site, and that was in two ways. You could either do the experience as a single person on your own, because we found through the research that a lot of people would go to St Fagans to walk their dog, go to St Fagans just to have a walk, or go to St Fagans just have a cup of coffee and to just sit in the space. So it wasn't necessarily seen as a place that was purely for education, in terms of I'm going to go to this museum, I'm going to go here to actually just have some downtime and spend some time for my own well-being. So we discovered that through the research. So we created a version that you could do on your own, and that led along an accessible route, so a wheelchair accessible route through the space, and took about half an hour. But then we also had a version which was for two people, and again this was through the research that a lot of couples would go there, or people would go with friends. So we made a version where you could do in pairs, and that took about 40 minutes. So you had this audio experience essentially that used composition to tell a story and journey you through. So a kind of unknown narrator almost, this untold guide that held your hand as you moved through the space. And then that guide would encourage you to have moments where you would stop and look, have moments where you could stop and, touch and feel the surface beneath your hands. There's a moment, I think, where we asked people to place their hands on a wall and feel that connection of touch between their hands and the fibre of the wall itself.
I think we actually asked them to leave a memory there,
yes,
which is, super enticing, and what an invitation.
Press your back against the wall, facing your partner. Place both palms flat on the surface of the wall either side of you. Close your eyes. See the happiest moment of your life. Conjure the shape of it. Feel the joy of it. Running as fast as you can when you were 6. Being kissed for the very first time. Falling in love. Allow it to fill your being. Would you leave this memory here for us, my friend? Would you leave it like the imprint of your hand within the stone, and make this place a part of you, and you a part of it, as Rose did, as Agnes has?
sometimes if you were doing the pair experience, you would be separated by the different audio tracks that each partner would have. So you'd kind of move away from each other, but then always come back to each other. So you'd move away, come back, going on different paths. And one part of the narration might ask you to look over across the garden to the gilded gate, and there you would see standing a figure holding the gate in their hands. And then that person's audio would ask them to stand in front of the gate and hold the bars of the gate and look through. So your partner became almost the actor in your experience.
So super cool.
Yeah. And I think that, again, that sort of embodiment of the experience, not only for the watcher, but also for the listener, and how those roles changed and intersected. And we tried to be really playful with it. I think there was a moment where we asked people to come together again. When you got separated, you'd meet your partner through the tunnel of this kind of amazing kind of vine tunnel with all these plants around it, and you got to play paper, scissors, stone. And just having those moments within that space, I think, were really fun. And we had described the piece, or somebody had described the piece, and we used it, I think, then within the marketing as a mix between a meditation and a game and storytelling, which I think does actually sum the experience up really, really quite nicely, because there are moments where we allow you to stop, take a pause, take everything in with all of the senses available to you. And there are moments of story that float between, I guess, fact and fiction. Part of the work that we did, we looked through the archives within St Fagans that were attached to St Fagans, and kind of had gone through the same process that we did with New Eyes I See. You know, what does the space tell us in terms of its history, as we've spoken about? And then also, what does the space give us in terms of how it can elicit certain feelings and moods? And depending on, and you touched upon this, depending on when you went during the year, because you're within a living space, a living environment, it could look so different in the summer where everything is in bloom, everything is green, to then if you go and do the experience then in the winter where everything is very different, and it gives you a different sense. So it's very organic in its being there, you know. So that in itself, which I don't think we appreciated when we were creating it, because I think we started working on the project, it must have been maybe within autumn, winter, and then when we released the project in summer, we realised this seasonal shift, which again gives people a very different feel to the story. And on this project, we worked with writer Sarah Lewis, a bilingual writer, who worked with us really, really closely on the narratives, looking at what is within the archives, and then what stories we can sort of have fictional license with, or artistic license with, and moments where we can maybe expand the story somewhat and take it away a little bit from some of the archives. And she is a beautiful writer, really, really lyrical. And when we came to look at the Welsh language version of Traces, so the Welsh language companion, Olion, I always remember her saying, you know, Welsh sings in a very different way to the English language. It has this musicality and lyricism, which is so different in terms of rhythm and pace and beat. And she treated that interpretation of the Welsh companion as a story in its own right.
Yeah, separate kind of work strand, wasn't it?
Absolutely. So it wasn't a direct translation. It was a piece in its own right that had the essence of the stories within the English, but sat as a Welsh language piece.
Dyma'u hoff le eistedd. Wrth dy ymyl, mae adlais o ddyn sy'n eistedd gyda'i gi, Bobby. Milgi bach arian las wedi ei beintio gan yr hwyrnos a'i drochi mewn serlwch. Fe ddaw e yma I ddianc rhag yr holl mae'n ei wybod, I ddarbwyllo'i hunan bod hyd a lledrith mewn byd o sylwedd gwyddonol a reswm. Mae e'n trio ailgysylltu, I wneud synwyr mewn byd sydd yn llawn strwythyr gronynog o ofod am ymrynnau. Mae'n hiraethu amser pan nad oedd ei ben mor llawn. Pan y fyddai'n gwrando'n ddiniwed ar bwsau ei dad. Mi fyddai dal i wrando am amser hir ar ôl iddo wybod ar atebion. Yn cogio bod yn syn bob tro. Honno oedd ei hoff dawns.
And then alongside the words of the piece, composition played a huge part in the storytelling and language. So we worked with a composer called Jack Poor, who we work with a lot. He's a brilliant composer, and he kind of took the essence of the words and used and crafted the composition in a way that allowed us to tell the story. So in places where between locations where we ask people to move, we might want people to have a fairly kind of quick pace. So the music would have this certain rhythm which dictated a pace. Moments where we wanted people to linger, the music changed, and it was a compliment then, or almost an actor in the piece, to Natalie Paisley, who was our actor, to that anonymous voice. So these two things very much inhabiting that space and telling the story together as a single entity almost. And what you said in terms of the technology, I think we are generally interested, and we've had lots of conversations about this, and we were interested in this piece about the technology enriching the experience, but not being the experience, not being front and centre, very much playing a part that it facilitates that for you. And even though the app was delivered on a mobile phone, we encouraged you to put that phone in your pocket, so it became an invisible companion to your experience as you moved through the sequence. So rather than looking at your screen, you were looking at the environment and the space around you, which was absolutely part of it. And I guess we were trying to make things feel quite filmic and frame certain parts of the garden or certain parts of the space. And so that framing of that space to, again, elicit that feeling and sense of place, as well as sense of place within the story that you were listening to, was really, really key part of what we were trying to do.
And as you were talking then, I was just thinking that one of the things we learned, I think, with New Eyes I See, that we took into Traces and maybe embraced a little bit more. I think with New Eyes I See, we were very worried about this kind of line between fact and fiction. We didn't want to kind of push too far at the narrative or to, begin to suggest other kinds of connections. We wanted to keep it very kind of, factual to these kind of fragments that we'd found. And I think in discussions then with the museum afterwards, I think they were quite intrigued that we had done that, because they maybe had hoped that we would push a little bit more actually at something that was a bit, a little bit more kind of lyrical or, mythical or, whatever it might be. And so I think we kind of took that permission with Traces and, embraced that a little bit more, worried less about kind of, sticking to those facts and not that we kind of, made lots of things up. It was kind of grounded in fact, but to have a little bit more kind of, playfulness, as you said, kind of, in the mix there, and to, suggest things in a way that we maybe didn't with New Eyes I See.
Going off of what you've just said about the less factual nature of it, and maybe discussing an element of it which was kind of about feeling and trying to elicit feeling, and that's definitely a projection on our part in terms of what we thought people might be feeling from the archival material, but that was still a kind of interesting new version. I guess you kind of mentioned it by the touch and the connection and things like that, and the mulberry tree. But then I think it's a point that we grew into that desire to try and make work that was specifically designed to emote a feeling and almost ignore story, or use story as a mechanic to get there, but not necessarily. It could literally just be, like you say, the happiness could be brought by you leaving that leaf, and seeing someone else's leaf there, or connection.
Digital heritage work, I think that's a really important observation, because museums are doing interpretation all over the place. Like, what they don't need is another bit of the same interpretation. The stories they're already telling, they may be telling perfectly well. People might be responding to that, in the ways that they are hoping they might. So they want us to do something a bit different. And I think we understood that more after with New Eyes I See. And actually, I was reminding myself in one of the papers that we presented, we said the words, "It does not provide more information, it provides more feels." And it tickled me when I read that back, because now people talk about the feels all the time.
I love the hyper-aggressive start of that, though. It does not provide more information.
No, and it was like there were lots of short sentences, lots of full stops. We were felt we needed to be very clear about what it was we were trying to do. More feels.
Yeah, absolutely more feels. Because you're right, the museum already provides that. And I suppose coming in as a team, we wanted to challenge those things, didn't we? In terms of, is there a different way we can tell stories within this space? Yeah. And what does that actually look like and feel like for audiences? And does that then potentially draw new audiences into that space because the interaction or the conversation is different?
Yeah.
And it might then provide maybe slightly different perspectives on those spaces as cultural institutions.
Yeah. And kind of that, layering of something else kind of, on top. And I was reminded as you were speaking then that at the time we were talking about this as the term we used was a subtlemob.
Oh, yeah.
So doing something that was quite kind of, subtle in the space. So there was lots of talk about flash mobs at the time, which were these big kind of noisy performative things that would happen in, train stations and all over the place. And you had come across this term subtlemob,
yes,
which I just loved.
Borrowed by Duncan Speakman from a company called Circumstance in Bristol.
Well remembered.
Yeah, inspired by his work and how they talk about these types of engagements in public space.
Yeah. And almost like imperceptible, kind of interactions that are happening and being layered into a place. So nobody knows that this like quite profound often thing is happening for you. You're just somebody who's walking around with your headphones on. Yeah.
Which I guess is part of the brief that the museum sort of gave us, really. It had to be something that was low maintenance for the staff to not really have to necessarily worry about. All they had to do was obviously let people know that there was something that they could do in that part of the grounds. So, and then also not be disruptive to generally the general running of that space.
Yeah.
So not having lots of things in space that had to, I don't know, be moved every now and again, or, whatever.
The bench. Tell us about the bench.
The bench. So what we had done with the design of the peaks was often ask people either to stand in a certain place or sit in a certain place. So there were some really lovely benches, always three white benches, just by some little oriental gardens just in front of the house. And those, every time we'd been, and this was over months of recce's, those three benches had always been there. And often when we were there, when me and Sarah would go and visit and try and track a route through the space, we'd sit on this bench and we would be like, this is a really nice place to have one of the locations. So let's get people to sit on this bench before then they turn the corner to meet their partner and do the
rock, paper, scissors. Yeah.
Rock, paper, scissors game. So that bench had always been there. And then what we discovered as months went on, things get moved in these spaces. And that bench, that white bench, got moved often. So because that white bench wasn't there, people would think it would be the next white bench along. So they'd sit on that white bench. So the next direction, which would be walk forward and turn right, would take them in a completely different direction.
Nightmare.
So what we've learned from that experience is things in physical spaces change and shift, particularly benches. So we're not going to do that again. When we would visit, if that bench had moved, we'd move it away from where it'd be moved to put it back in the original position. I've done that at least 4 times. I mean, the groundskeepers were like, why does this bench keep moving? We always tried to do it at the end of the day, so it was almost as if the bench had, walked itself back to its location. So yeah, that was hilarious because it did knock people off their journeys.
Bane of our life, that
it
bench.
Was the bane of that bench.
But you mentioned the groundskeepers there, and actually they were super important in the story of Traces, because was it you? Was it Sarah who chatted with the gardeners, and they were full of stories, and those stories were not getting told. So we were able to kind of capture that and integrate some of those stories into the narrative.
Yeah, they were absolutely amazing. The people that we spoke to who worked day to day in those spaces were incredible. Yeah, and the knowledge that they had about that space and the passion that they had about that space as well, I think really, really influenced the direction of some of the ways that we wanted people to interact with that space. Absolutely. Yeah, the kind of almost reverence of that space was just so warming every time we spoke to them. So we wanted to bring that into the experience for other people to feel that sense of joy actually within, moments of darkness within the narrative as well, so that light and joy, that darkness and light very much being part of the experience. And yeah, without their input, it wouldn't necessarily be the piece that it became. And being able to have the opportunity to integrate that into the narrative was brilliant.
I have been called collector and guide, the unraveller of thread. Surrender yourself to this journey, to the order and disorder, the clarity and confusion, the artistry and chaos. See yourself reflected in the tales you hear, in the people you will meet. Agnes and Rose and the others. They will sometimes walk with you, but you will not see them. You will not need to see them. But will their stories help you to remember, to release, to receive, to resolve? These are the stories that make the trees grow. They nourish the soil. There is a reason that you are here today. You are at the centre of this journey, and at the centre you will be. You alone will hear what you hear and feel what you feel. Is your sorrow like any other? This moment has passed, and you must move on to the next. We must enter the labyrinth together. Are you ready for what you will find?
I guess the interesting bit from our perspective, again, was an element of basically deciding on whether the stuff we're making is good or crap, right? And I think the research or the ability to then get people either interviewed or to mind map where they've been and to do that kind of collection of their experience kind of informed your work anyway for the next 10 years in a sense, right? In the sense that it was the idea of needing to go beyond just like, yeah, it was great, 3 stars, because I guess that's kind of a traditional theatre background. That's all you need. But the point was, I guess, was it more effective, or was it as not effective seems like a definitive kind of thing, but did it have any impact beyond just a normal museum, experience or a normal walk around St. Fagans? And I think the research you guys did seemed at least to be, a big part of the project, and its superpower really in a sense.
We got so much rich data, as I like to call it, insight from people, coming out of that project. So we spent, I think, 2 or 3 days on site. We had some PhD students who we paid to come and join us. We had lots of conversations with people kind of before they went and did the experience. Some did the single experience, some did the partner experience. There was obviously the Welsh language one as well, so some people did that, and that was in the single and the partner experience as well. So there were 4 experiences. And then so they would go off and they would do the experience, and then they would come back. We would have conversations with them, but that would start with a kind of a couple of activities. So we asked them, I think, now am I going to mess up the order of this? So we asked them to write down, I think, 3 words that kind of summed up the experience for them on a piece of paper. And then we asked them to map their experience, and we left that kind of instruction quite kind of open, so they could kind of, interpret that however they liked. And some people would map it quite literally in terms of the space, and how they'd navigated that, where they'd been, and, drawing little kind of, elements of the experience, the bridges, the buildings and whatnot. And then other people would map the kind of emotional landscape of the experience, which was really lovely to, to see, and again unprompted, so those maps were that was really great to see how people embraced doing that. They were really lovely. And then we would have a conversation with people where we would ask them to talk us through their map, talk us through the words that they'd chosen, and then we would ask them maybe some more kind of specific questions, and or we would give them some more specific prompts to talk about the experience in terms of space, immersion, how they were feeling, and all the rest of it. So we had some really rich data come through there. And we wrote a couple of papers, I think, using that data, which I would encourage people to read, because the data it's lovely. The way people talked about the project and the incredible range of different meanings that had for them. And I guess that's, as you say, when you've got your 3 stars and a 1-word review, it's quite remote. You don't get access to all of that unexpected and unanticipated stuff that's going on for people, and the connections that they start to make. And people talked about their family connections, and the fact that they were getting married in a week's time, and they'd found this incredibly romantic, doing this together, or people who were doing it with their friends, or who were grieving for loved ones, or the connections were incredible. So people, they talked a lot about emotions. They talked a lot about the kind of sociality of the experience, especially with that kind of partner journey. I think we'd managed to achieve something that was very much kind of not tech-centric. So people, apart from where the kind of, if there was a moment where the tech had kind of, they'd got out of alignment or something like that, and things hadn't quite matched up maybe with the narratives as people had kind of, joined back together. People didn't really notice the technology, and that was really nice. So to kind of, not to have that front and center in the experience. And of course, the storytelling, people, really enjoyed the storytelling, and we had this wonderful narration and this beautiful musical composition in the background. But one of the things that came through for me quite strongly was this sense of, hybridity. So, this thing existing kind of between the digital and the physical. And people have very strong, I think anyway, kind of emotional attachments to the space and place of St Fagans, because they went there with school, or they've been there with their grandkids, or whatever it might be. To kind of, to encourage them to have a different kind of experience within that space that happened to be facilitated digitally was great. And there were a few moments where that hybridity, I think, was really, impressive, and people would talk about it. There's a moment, so St Fagans, the house there, had, again, another kind of World War I connection. It had been used as a hospital for returning soldiers. And there's a moment in the narrative where one of the, in the partner experience, one of you, but in the single experience, you as the person who's experiencing it, sits on a bench and looks out over this area of the gardens that has these mulberry trees in it. And these are really kind of, especially in the winter when there's no leaves on these trees, they're gnarly and awkward, and they look like they're bursting out of the ground. And it looked like a scene of kind of devastation, and people would sit on the bench and they would be told about Mehmet's Wood, and these soldiers whose lives were, devastated. in the war, and who then came back to St Fagans to try and kind of, rebuild their lives. And it was so evocative, that space, those trees. And so, that was such a clever piece of the narrative. I can say that because I didn't write the narrative. It was so clever. And that moment where we asked people to put their hands on the stone and leave a memory, it's so tactile. Again, quite a kind of, it's digital, but it's physical. And there was another bit of the narrative where we asked people to leave a leaf or something, to take a leaf from a tree and to leave it for somebody else. And so if somebody else had done the experience that day, it would just be a little kind of simple marker to tell you, to connect you with somebody who was, no longer in that space. So just really nice, clever moments like that people, really appreciated and reflected on, fulsomely. And I think there was very much a sense that people felt that their relationship with that place was kind of altered by doing traces. And I cannot be at St Fagans without thinking about traces and without wanting to put my hands back on that piece of stone and to connect with that, and that's so rich. For a digital heritage project or for a museum, what powerful kind of connections we were building there for people.
And I guess that's almost, 10 years ago now? Nearly? Maybe a bit less?
We were trying to work out the date, so I think it must have been 2016, 17-ish, maybe 2016 when we'd started working on the project.
Just to have that kind of longevity of impact is kind of really interesting. Obviously, makers of the piece, so you're a bit more kind of like connected to it, but it's still kind of really interesting. Yeah,
it would be great to pick up with some of those people again who did it, and to this longitudinal thing.
And
we could do that. Quick, write that down.
Yeah, write that down.
We'll do
the
that.
Next project.
And to think about those kind of legacies, which I hypothesize would be quite strong. I think.
Yeah, and that memory of that place and the experience of that place, that those type of experiences can, as you said, remain with you whether you're in that space or not, or elements of the moments that you have that you end up taking into, I don't know, other parts of your life.
I guess in many ways, as we hinted upon a while back, a lot of things have happened in the last 5 or 6 years. We've had a pandemic that's obviously impacted a lot of people, and new technologies have also kind of come out the woodwork, and specifically over the last 12 months with things like AI and things that they've kind of, we would be led to believe that they've taken over the world instantly.
Not yet.
Yeah. How much people are using them is kind of, I think, still very much up for debate, but definitely some people are using them day in, day out, and other people are kind of at least know and have heard about AI. So yeah, should we kind of talk about where we see the future of some of this kind of work going and some elements of it? And I guess we kind of started that conversation previously, or I'd argue with the idea of, what do you do with old digital experiences, games and things like that. It's still very similar in the same realm, but now we have these new technologies that can almost recreate things and mimic things. And I think there's this conversation about, and always has been really, but it feels like even more so. And I'm reminded by Ian M. Banks's book, Player of Games, where there's a little line in that where the technology has got so good already that no one can be blackmailed because everyone knows that everything can be falsified, which is kind of an interesting kind of like thing where you get to a point where you can't believe in truth because truth can be literally doctored. There's this kind of interest. Well, blackmail becomes irrelevant because it's like, and how do you,
like the silver lining, isn't it?
Yeah. It's kind of like, how do you prove that it's real? Because it looks real, it feels real.
Yeah.
I think there was one element that could make it real in the book, but generally speaking, everyone just went, yeah. Well,
this is the big problem, isn't it, with disinformation and misinformation? It's not so much that you believe one particular thing that tells you that isn't true. The problem is when you can't trust anything, and so you just don't know. You can't see the wood for the trees.
And I guess it's a bit like your an interview technique. and, preempting or leading questions. It's the same idea, isn't it? As soon as you've seen that video, even if your brain then goes, that's not real, your brain has kind of said it's real. You've already been affected by it in some way. And then 4 years down the line, you kind of remember and go, did that person do that? Or was that a fake video? Do you know what I mean? Like your brain's already taken it in and gone, yeah, that's fine. So it'd be an interesting conversation moving forward, like as to, are our brains capable, suitably sophisticated to almost kind of like filter post and kind of go, that's not a thing.
What kind of literacy do we need in order to do that? Yeah. These are big old questions.
Yeah.
And then massive challenges for museums and heritage sites and archives who, have all of these digital assets. They've got all of this stuff relating to cultural icons and historic figures and all the rest of it. And what can you and should you do with that stuff when AI kind of comes into the mix? And that's kind of what our next project is thinking about.
Tell us a little bit about what you're working on now.
Okay, so this is a project which is called Synthetic Pasts, and myself and my colleague Eva McAvoy, who's at King's College London. So actually this kind of came out of the COVID social media trawling and what are we gonna look at, what are we gonna think about. We were already collaborating on some stuff, and during COVID, one day one of us was on social media and came across these recreations, these archival recreations that people were sharing. So you may remember there was a little bit of kit called Deep Nostalgia that was released by this company called MyHeritage, who are a genealogy company. And this bit of kit, Deep Nostalgia, allowed you to upload an image from your own archive, normally of a kind of deceased ancestor, and it would kind of animate that picture. It would kind of bring it to life, as it were. That was kind of the claim. And all of a sudden on social media, everybody was sharing these things. It was like everyone was like super excited and intrigued, but also massively creeped out by these kind of creations that people were sharing. And we thought that was kind of interesting. So we took a kind of snapshot of the social media activity around that sharing. And we did a study of that. So, again, firstly, kind of quantitatively, what were people sharing? What were they animating? All the rest of it. And then kind of looking at how people were talking about those about what it kind of meant to animate things in that way. And so for some people, that was quite kind of, profound in terms of their memories of ancestors, being able to, animate somebody who they had lost, and talking about the kind of emotional kind of, weight of doing that. And then for some people, being able to animate somebody who they had never met and all of a sudden see them smile. And we were like, okay, what's going on there? In terms of people's memories, that's really interesting. So you can now remember somebody smiling who you never saw smile in your life. What kind of a memory is that? Can it be trusted? Does it matter if it can't? That raised lots of interesting questions for us. So Synthetic Pasts is a project that has kind of emerged from that initial study, and kind of, looks at things a bit more in the round. So we're looking more generally at kind of automation and AI and how they're being used to bring archival materials, to life. So that's personal archival materials, but also kind of cultural archival materials as well. So historic sites and museums kind of being in the mix there as well. And they are already doing some of this stuff. So, for example, at the Dali Museum in Florida, you can walk into the museum and you can have a chat with Dali. It's a kind of synthetic media recreation of Dali, which is kind of grounded in lots of images and footage and all the rest of it. And you meet him, he's stood there, he's holding, today's paper, he knows what the weather's like outside. He turns around at the end of this interaction you have with him and he takes a selfie of you with him and then he posts it to you. And, so these kind of, it's quite weird, but of course it's quite intriguing. People quite like it. So there's that one. There's also another program called Hello Vincent, which is a kind of Vincent van Gogh recreation. which is based on his kind of letters. So you can kind of have a conversation with Vincent van Gogh about how he was feeling in the months leading up to his death, or, you know, how he felt about, what people were saying about his artworks at the time, or, you know, whatever it might be. And it kind of, you know, sources an answer to your questions from all of that material. There are other examples as well of where they're using AI to give people interactions with Holocaust survivors. So using, footage, filmed recordings, so that you can have a kind of chat with a survivor. Or there are other projects that are using kind of image generators to work with Holocaust survivors to, you know, kind of recreate their journeys, you know, sitting down with them and recreating their journeys using generative AI images. And so there are lots of these sorts of practices, and we think this is really interesting, and it's not going to go anywhere. That kind of practice is going to become more kind of mundane and everyday in these institutions, but of course there are things you need to think about as you're doing that work. There's the whole kind of bit about ethics in the mix there, questions about, you know, consent, posthumous consent, you know, how do we kind of navigate all of that? There are questions about the kind of data practices of the companies that kind of support these initiatives. Museums and heritage sites, in our research, we've found that they are quite worried about kind of working with third parties that don't, you know, tech companies that don't quite, you know, often know what kinds of interactions and relationships they're getting into. What are the responsibilities of those tech companies in terms of custodianship, their, you know, privacy, you know, all the rest of it, where they're sourcing their data from, all the rest of it. So there are big kind of ethical questions about it all. But then there are also those questions about memory as well, and what all of this might mean for our kind of memories going forward, you know, deceptive memories, distortions of memory, you know, how consequential is all of that. So the project is going to be exploring some of that. We've you know, done things like social media analysis already, and a kind of, you know, analysis of the creations themselves. We've also done things like recently we did a big content analysis to look at how the news media kind of talk about these practices. So specifically in relation to cultural icons, so the kind of Tupac hologram, the Whitney Houston hologram, Audrey Hepburn selling Galaxy bars, you know. So we did a big study of how kind of people talked about those practices within the mainstream, which we've just completed. And we're also going to do some kind of walkthroughs of people, so sit down with people as they're making these recreations, say, of their ancestors, and making decisions even about whether they want to do it, you know, and to talk with them about you know, how they feel and experience those processes, and what some of the kind of memorative kind of, you know, impacts might be. And we're also going to do some stuff around kind of like looking at the terms and conditions of the tech companies, the policies in relation to some of these practices, and thinking about how they understand their responsibilities in relation to what have been termed algorithmic afterlives. This is a term that we're using a lot in the project. I guess we're expecting that they haven't thought too much about all of that, but, you know, we'll see what that throws up. And then there are also some kind of quite creative things that we're trying to do around the edges, including with Yellow Brick to you know, maybe provide some kind of tools and some kind of provocations for people who might be in their kind of day-to-day work, like museum and heritage practitioners, needing to think through some of these issues. So can we provide a kind of quite kind of interactive and innovative, you know, toolkit or case study or something like that that can help them to think about those practices. So kind of lots going on with all of that.
And it's really interesting because we've sort of come back full circle, haven't we, to the question of how do we remember, and what does that look like and what does that mean, and the impact of that then in 10 years' time or 20 years' time or even 30 years' time into the future. And I suppose for the tech companies who are working with this, within this realm, things around ownership and how that's used elsewhere. Can it be used elsewhere? And who has those permissions?
I think as well, I've never thought about it up until you kind of mentioned some of the bits, the examples then, but it's kind of started way back with black and white photos being coloured in.
Yeah.
You know, that's not real colour. It's kind of an extrapolation of what they think. And And then I think we are a week, or maybe 3 or 4 days this week, and it was WWDC, so Apple's kind of software conference. And Tim Cook has introduced a new way of making old photos 3D through their new Vision Pro kind of headsets. And his example when being interviewed by Marquez Brownlee was the fact that his parents died at a very early age, and so he could 3D the photos of his parents, you know, that kind of thing. So walking in a space, not necessarily, you know, being the person, but literally walking around those spaces, and that idea of what is real, what is memory, all really becomes a massive thing. And I guess maybe up to this point, like you were saying, it's been shows up to this point, or it's been TV adverts, or I guess the biggest use has been CGI in film, to de-age someone or to bring someone back. I'm thinking like Harrison Ford is like 80, but he's also 30 in some of the Indiana Jones.
And the avatars as well.
Yeah. So it's kind of just really interesting to see that kind of stuff coming then into the real world, if you like. And I guess it's literally where your border of comfortableness lies, and where other people's borders lie, and they will be overlap in a negative way, because some people say that's too far, that's not far enough. And it'd be very interesting to see how things move forward, and what, if anything, not legislation, but like what kind of moral rules do we wrap around these things to try and kind of pick our way through.
Yeah, and I suppose it's linked to all of the questions around, digital death and the legacy of even things like Facebook accounts and Instagram accounts when people pass. What happens to those? How are they, immortalised within that digital space? Who is that for, and why? And also, why do we feel we need these things to keep that person's memory alive, or to... Yeah, it's really interesting, isn't it? Like, I have in my purse a piece of paper that is just literally a list written by my dad, who passed away two years ago. And it sits in my purse. I'm not quite sure why I've put it there, but it's there as, I guess, a physical connection to him in some way. It's not obviously a picture or anything like that, but it is something that's been crafted and created by him and touched by him. So I wonder, when people are looking at these, photographic things to bring people to life in that way, I guess it is within the same kind of realm, but I think your brain knows it's not real. It's still uncanny valley, isn't it?
Yeah.
It just doesn't quite look right. Does that matter? Or are people wanting to do it for different reasons, because they're worried about forgetting what that person looks like, and wondering and trying to, again, coming back to that, trying to embody that person, to hold on to that memory in a kind of stronger way, maybe. I don't know.
Yeah. One of the things I thought was really interesting with Deep Nostalgia, as we kind of dug into the technology and how it works, it's the way they bring these photos to life is by using driver videos. So they've recorded these driver videos, people, in their office at DID, who's the company who provides the technology for MyHeritage. So these driver videos are used then to enliven these photos. So what you're looking at when you're looking at one of those recreations is two faces, actually. This kind of this mashing together of data bodies, and so who are you remembering? It's just like super fascinating. And I think actually thinking back to the kind of immersive work that we were talking about, of course, increasingly, as you've noted, these kinds of practices will kind of shift into those kinds of spaces, as well. And so these kind of algorithmic afterlives will be wandering around in virtual environments for us to interact with as well. So there's a lot to think about.
I forget who is. I think I sent you a link to an article where I can't remember the name of the person. So the artist that I could not remember at this point was a musician called Laurie Anderson, who has made a AI chatbot related to her husband, Lou Reed. So I've put the link in the bio for you, everyone. But her husband partner passed away, was a very famous artist, singer, and she's basically feeding an AI and has fed the AI letters, content and songs that were written, and now that AI is generating songs in the vein of. So is that still, what is that? Is that in essence what could have been produced by that artist, or it has kind of two faces, where it's the computer putting together what it can imagine is being created, but it's not the creation of the artist, it's the creation of basically an input into a computer, and the computer is inherently making it. It's really interesting. And is that still artistic work?
Yeah. I mean, massive questions about creative labour, and look at the strikes in the US in recent years, and there's going to be these debates are going to be kind of supercharged, aren't they, in the coming years? But as you were talking, I was just thinking about, I think you can already make a copy. Of course, you can make copies of people's voices, but you can load it now into Amazon, or at least there was some suggestion that you would be able to. And then your Amazon Alexa in your kitchen could have the voice, say, of, an ancestor, or, a student could make one of me, who they could chat with in their kitchen. And then there's all the stuff about like what happens if somebody then uses your voice to say things that are incompatible with your own sense of self and politics or whatever it might be. And I mean, it's just, there's so much to think about.
There's a lot of stock libraries or areas where AI engines have effectively collected data from. So Adobe has obviously got its AI engine, and most people have been not freely, they've been putting images on their libraries to, then get commission for people downloading, just like an image library would traditionally work. But that has been then funneled into the AI to then generate those type of images, therefore eventually
putting all of those people out of work.
Those artists kind of out of work. The interesting thing about the person being fed stories, it's a weird nepotism thing, but for AI, right? And it kind of reminds me in a way of, it's kind of happened indirectly, but with like sons. So I'm thinking like Frank Herbert writing Dune, and then his son kind of then following on with further books down the line. But it's kind of it's kind of really similar, isn't it? It's like it's very unlikely that person would have been as prominent and written those books without the aid of his father establishing that storyline and things like that. But it'd be very interesting to see how it moves forward, and whether it becomes all nothing is real, nothing is fact. And I feel like a lot of it, I mean, I don't want to go down the Black Mirror route, but a lot of the stuff that we've done on social media, a fair amount of it has shown mental health problems and things like that. I can only imagine dwelling in the past isn't a particularly positive thing for human beings' psyche. Generally, it feels like we are a race that moves forward, and history has things to teach us, but maybe it's not something we want to dwell in day out. So it'd be interesting to see if we, not in a morbid way, but like how we can maintain resilience against those kind of things of past that might jar, with us because of our understanding of who those people were and things like that. Yeah, don't know.
And I think that's a wrap, folks. Thank you so much for coming to chat with us. We really appreciate your time. It's been amazing to hear about the projects that you've got coming up, and your origin stories, which I had no idea about.
Thank you for helping me unearth it.
Dreamweaver was just like,
I was like, wow,
I know,
slightly triggered by that.
Thank you for having me. That was, it was just super fun to think back through it all, and to find actually that there are these threads over the years that tie things together that I quite often think are all a bit kind of haphazard and all over the shop. So
we're going back and recreating our histories. It was clearly planned, from A it clearly went to B and then C. It's really weird though. the kind of collection, the way you started collecting things in a digital storytelling sense and digital storytelling for individuals and them having a power, if you like, the ability to tell a story and people wanting to hear that. And I remember a lot of people that we worked when we were doing Think Arc would kind of in the realms of, collecting stories digitally, and digital storytelling was kind of the buzzword. But then that's kind of now literally an AI bot making a story, and you're just kind of like, it's just incredible how things have moved on. And I won't say that's good or bad, it's just a fact.
But then also the same kind of topics kind of coming back from from the beginning to the start. It's
the need for feel and the need to remove technology where possible. I feel it will always be there, right? I feel like that, the obviousness of technology. Maybe unless it's AI, and then you just need a stamp saying this is AI, but that's another thing, I guess, altogether. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Hopefully that wasn't so scary.
I enjoyed it.
Yeah, good, thank you.
I didn't think I would say that, but I did.
No, yeah, you were brilliant.
You can end it before I said that.
Thank you so much for listening this month. Hope you enjoyed it, and if you know someone who might like this podcast, do consider sharing it with them. Thanks again.